Welcome back, everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to continue building on our understanding of the American legal system by focusing on two critically important themes. First, we're going to be discussing the institutional sources of American law, specifically the role courts play in shaping constitutional meaning and public policy. And to do this, we're going to examine one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, that being Brown v. Board of Education. Then we're going to shift into the judicial system itself and discuss courts and jurisdiction. In particular, we'll examine two different cases of how the courts determine when they have authority over a person or corporation. That will lead us to our two foundational civil procedure cases, International Shoe Co. v. Washington and Helicopteros Nacionales de Colombia v. Hall. At first, these cases might seem unrelated. Brown is about racial segregation and equality, while International Shoe and Helicopteros are about lawsuits and jurisdiction. But they do have one common thread tying them together, and that's about the power of the courts. Brown demonstrates the Supreme Court's ability to reshape constitutional rights and social policy, and International Shoe Co. and Helicopteros demonstrate the courts themselves are also constrained by constitutional limits, particularly due process. So throughout this lecture, keep asking yourself how powerful should courts be, and what constitutional limits should exist on that power. Now, by the end of this lecture, you should understand how the courts function as institutional sources of law, especially through constitutional interpretation. You should also be able to explain why Brown v. Board of Education remains one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history. Then we'll transition into jurisdiction and civil procedure. You should be able to define personal jurisdiction, explain the minimum contract standard established in International Shoe, and distinguish between specific jurisdiction and general jurisdiction. This becomes especially important in Helicopteros. To understand Brown v. Board of Education, first we need to understand the legal world that existed before Brown. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, many of the southern states began passing a series of laws collectively known as Jim Crow laws. I'm sure you've heard of these. These laws enforced racial segregations in schools, transportation, restaurants, housing, and just many other aspects of daily life. The Supreme Court largely approved of this system in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson. In Plessy, the court upheld racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. The idea here was that racial segregation was supposedly constitutional so long as black facilities and white facilities, and white citizens and black citizens were technically treated as equals. But in reality, this was never the case, and we all knew this. Black schools often received dramatically less funding, they had inferior facilities, fewer educational resources, many overcrowded classrooms, and just lower teacher salaries. So most importantly, segregation itself communicated a message of inferiority. And this brings us to the 14th Amendment, particularly the Equal Protection Clause, which states that no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the laws. The major constitutional question became, can segregation ever truly be equal under the Constitution? The facts of Brown v. Board of Education are deeply important because they remind us that constitutional law involves real people and real lives. The case centered around Linda Brown, a young black girl living in Topeka, Kansas. Linda was required to attend an all-black elementary school that was further away from her home, even though a white elementary school was located much closer to her. Her father, Oliver Brown, attempted to enroll her in a nearby white school, but she was denied admission solely because of her race. With assistance from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Brown family challenged the constitutionality of school segregation. It's important to understand that Brown was not just one lawsuit. The Supreme Court consolidated several different segregation cases from different states into one single decision. The NAACP strategically selected these cases in an effort to directly challenge the constitutionality of segregation itself. This was not simply about transportation, inconvenience, or school equality. The broader argument was that segregation inherently violated equal protection under the Constitution. The constitutional question in the case of Brown v. Board of Education was, does racial segregation in public schools violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And notice how broad and powerful this question is. The court was not merely deciding whether one school district acted unfairly. The court was deciding whether an entire legal structure that had existed for decades was constitutional. The defenders of segregation argued that separate schools could still be equal under Plessy v. Ferguson, but the challengers argued something much more fundamental, that segregation itself creates inequality. Even if buildings, books, or salaries were theoretically equal, which they weren't, segregation still imposes social and psychological harm by labeling black children as inferior. That argument became central to the court's eventual reasoning. In 1954, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion. The court held that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The most famous line from the case states, "Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." That sentence fundamentally changed American constitutional law, and the court emphasized that education plays a critical role in modern society and that segregation generates feelings of inferiority that can negatively affect children both psychologically and socially. And most importantly, the court rejected the idea that equality could exist with some sort of segregated structure. But Brown did not obviously obviously eliminate all of segregation immediately, and it certainly didn't eliminate racism, but legally and constitutionally, it marked the beginning of the end of state-sponsored segregation. Brown v. Board matters for many reasons beyond public education. First, Brown demonstrates the enormous power of judicial review. The Supreme Court effectively declared that state segregation laws violated the Constitution. Second, Brown shows the courts are institutional sources of law. Courts don't merely enforce rules mechanically. Through constitutional interpretation, they actively shape public policy and societal norms. Third, Brown became a major catalyst for the civil rights movement. At the same time, Brown also demonstrates the limits of judicial power. Now, it should be noted that many of the states resisted this integration aggressively. Some schools delayed integration for years. Political leaders in several southern states openly opposed the ruling. And this reminds us of something important. The courts can issue decisions, but the implementation of these rules often depends on other institutions, including legislators, executive officials, and the public. So Brown reflects both the strength and limitations of judicial authority within American society. Now we're going to shift from constitutional equality into structure and the authority of the judicial system itself. One of the most fundamental questions in law is this: when does a court have authority over someone? This concept is known as jurisdiction. I'm sure you've heard of this. There are different forms of jurisdiction, but today we're primarily focused on personal jurisdiction, meaning a court's authority over a particular defendant. And this raises an important constitutional concerns involving due process and fairness. After all, is it fair to force someone to defend themselves in a state where they barely conduct business or almost have no connection? Those questions become especially important as commerce expands across state lines. Now, before we dive into the case of international shoe, we need to discuss a little bit of Pennoyer versus Neff, territorial approach, and physical presence. So, the courts before international shoe generally followed a much stricter territorial approach to jurisdiction, and this came from the older framework of Pennoyer versus Neff. And under this approach, the courts focused heavily on physical presence. If a defendant was physically present within the state, then the courts generally had jurisdiction over them. But as businesses expanded nationally, this framework became increasingly impractical. Companies could conduct business across multiple states without having any offices or property in those states. The legal system needed a much more flexible rule to address modern commerce. So now we dive into the facts of International Shoe. International Shoe Company was incorporated in Delaware and headquartered in Missouri. The company sold shoes nationwide using traveling salesmen. Several of those salesmen worked extensively in Washington state, soliciting orders and conducting business activities there. However, International Shoe argued that because the company lacked a formal office or warehouse in Washington, then the state lacked jurisdiction over the company. Washington state attempted to collect unemployment taxes from the corporation, and the company challenged the state's authority to sue it in Washington courts. So the Supreme Court had to answer a major constitutional question: when can a state exercise jurisdiction over an out-of-state corporation? And this is where we get into the minimum contracts test. The Supreme Court created one of the most important doctrines in civil procedure, the minimum contracts test. The court held that states may exercise jurisdiction over out-of-state defendants when those defendants have sufficient minimum contacts within the forum state, such that the lawsuit does not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. That language becomes foundational in American law. So the key idea here is fairness. So if a corporation deliberately conducts its business within a state, and it's benefiting economically from that state, and it interacts regularly with that state's residents, then it may be fair to require that corporation to defend lawsuits there. That only makes sense. So International Shoe dramatically modernized jurisdiction doctrine and adapted the law to an increasingly national economy. The case of International Shoe remains enormously influential even today. Think about online businesses like, say, Amazon or just companies selling products nationwide over the internet. Without International Shoe, jurisdictional rules would almost become impossible to apply to the modern economy. So the case created a more flexible standard centered around fairness and meaningful connections rather than just a rigid physical presence alone. And importantly, the doctrine balances two competing interests: the state's interest in regulating activity within its borders and the defendant's constitutional due process rights. So now we're getting into the case of Helicopteros Nacionales de Colombia v. Hall, which involved a helicopter crash involved in Peru that killed several American citizens. So the families of the decedents filed suit in Texas against Helicopteros, which is a Colombian corporation. So you gotta be asking, why did they file this in Texas? Well, that's because the company had purchased helicopters and training services from businesses that were located in Texas. However, the actual crash occurred in Peru, and the company was headquartered in Colombia, and most of its relevant activities occurred outside of Texas, despite the fact that they had gotten training in Texas. So the Supreme Court had to determine whether those Texas business ties and the contacts they had had in the state of Texas were enough to allow Texas courts to exercise jurisdiction. And this is where we get into general versus specific jurisdiction. So specific jurisdiction is a lawsuit arising from the defendant's contacts within the forum state, and general jurisdiction is continuous and systematic contacts. The defendant can be sued there for almost anything. So the case becomes extremely important because it clarifies the distinction between specific jurisdiction and general jurisdiction. So to give you another example of specific jurisdiction, if a company sells a defective product in, say, Florida, and someone is injured in Florida, Florida courts likely have that specific jurisdiction. But general jurisdiction is broader. Think of it like as more generalizable, right? But general jurisdiction exists when a defendant's connections to a state are so continuous and systematic that the defendant can essentially be sued there for almost any claim, even unrelated ones. And so the question in Helicopteros was whether the company's business activities in Texas were substantial enough to create that general jurisdiction. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled that Texas lacked jurisdiction. The court held that merely purchasing helicopters and training services from Texas companies was not enough to establish the continuous and systematic contacts required for general jurisdiction. This distinction reinforced an important constitutional principle. Not every business interaction creates unlimited legal exposure. The Due Process Clause places limits on state authority. Defendants must have meaningful, substantial connections to the forum state before courts can exercise broad authority over them. So in all three cases we discussed today involve the courts exercising enormous institutional power. Brown demonstrates courts reshaping constitutional equality and public policy. International Shoe and Helicopteros demonstrate the courts defining the boundaries of their own authority. And together these cases reveal something central about the American legal system. That being, the courts are incredibly powerful institutions, but they're also heavily constrained by constitutional principles like due process, fairness, and legitimacy. And that tension between judicial power and constitutional limitation remains one of the more defining features of American law. So as we conclude today's lecture, remember these core takeaways. Brown v. Board of Education fundamentally changed constitutional law and rejected segregation in public schools. International Shoe established the minimum contacts doctrine. It still governs jurisdiction today. Helicopteros clarified the distinction between specific and general jurisdiction. And perhaps most importantly, all of these cases show that the courts are not passive institutions. They actively shape the meaning, reach, and limits of the law.